Crimea, a small peninsula in the Black Sea. Yet for centuries, it has been the stage of some of history's fiercest conflicts. A land fought over by empires: the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Russians, and the Europeans. Blood was spilled, cities were besieged and burned, and entire peoples were uprooted from their homes. From Crimea, wars erupted that reshaped the world. And from Crimea, decisions were made that created the modern international order. And today, Crimea remains a flashpoint that could ignite a world war. In 1441, the Crimean Tatars founded their own state, the Crimean Khanate. Its first ruler was Hagi Jire, who made Bakhchishar his capital, a city of mosques, palaces, and bustling markets. But their independence did not last long. In 1475, the Ottomans seized Crimea's coasts, took control of its ports, and made the Khan a vassal of the Sultan. From that day on, the Crimean Tatars became the Ottoman sword in their endless wars against Russia. The 18th century changed everything. Imperial Russia under Catherine the Great no longer settled for Moscow and St. Petersburg. It wanted access to the warm seas. Bloody wars with the Ottoman Empire erupted. Russian armies marched across the steppes. Cannons thundered against fortresses, and city after city fell. In 1774, Russia forced the Sultan to sign the Treaty of Kuka-Kanarka, a humiliating deal that ended centuries of Ottoman dominance and opened the door for Russian influence in Crimea. Less than a decade later, in 1783, Russian troops entered Crimea and raised their flag over its fortresses. Thus ended the rule of the Tatars, and a new chapter began, making Crimea Russia's gateway to the Black Sea. But the struggle did not end. In 1853, the First Crimean War broke out. The Russian Navy destroyed Ottoman ships at the Battle of Sinop, sparking outrage across Europe. Britain and France landed their armies on the peninsula, igniting fierce battles. The siege of Sevastopol lasted 11 months, as the city crumbled under hunger and bombardment. And in the valley of Balaclava came the tragic charge of the Light Brigade. Hundreds of British cavalry rode straight into Russian guns due to a fatal mistake. Most never returned, but the moment became legend. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1856, which checked Russia's power, but left Crimea still in its grip. The 20th century brought new storms. The 1917 revolution toppled the Russian Empire and made Crimea part of the Soviet Union. Then came World War II, turning Crimea into a front of fire and steel. In November 1941, Nazi forces invaded the peninsula. Their tanks swept across the plains. Their planes bombed ports and bridges, and city after city fell. Then came the siege of Sevastopol. A fortress city became a symbol of resistance. German heavy artillery, including the massive Dora cannon, pounded its defenses day and night. Air raids turned neighborhoods into rubble. Soviet soldiers fought from house to house, while civilians hid in tunnels and caves. Hunger and thirst proved deadlier than bullets. After 8 brutal months, the defenses collapsed and Sevastopol fell in July 1942. But in May 1944, the Red Army returned with overwhelming force. Artillery opened the way. Tanks stormed the plains, and paratroopers landed behind enemy lines. Street by street, hill by hill, the Nazis were driven out after bloody battles. Yet the victory was poisoned by tragedy. Stalin accused the Crimean Tatars of treason, blaming an entire people for the actions of a few. At dawn, soldiers knocked on doors and gave families only minutes to gather what they could. Hundreds of thousands were torn from their homes and packed into cattle trains. It was not relocation, it was slow death. Thirst, hunger, and disease claimed tens of thousands of lives. 1 out of every 3 never made it alive. Behind Stalin's cruelty was a bigger plan: to change Crimea's demography forever. He emptied the land of its native Tatars and repopulated it with Russians and Ukrainians, laying the seeds of today's conflict. Less than a year later, in February 1945, Crimea hosted an event that reshaped the globe. The Yalta Conference. In the Levadia Palace, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill drew the map of the post-war world. From here came the division of Europe, the Nuremberg trials, and the founding of the United Nations and the Security Council. In 1954, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea administratively from Russia to Ukraine. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Crimea became part of independent Ukraine. And Ukraine made a historic decision. It allowed the Crimean Tatars, the native people who had been deported, to return to their homeland. Tens of thousands came back from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Siberia, rebuilding their lives despite poverty, marginalization, and endless obstacles. But in 2014, the storm returned. Protests in Kyiv toppled the pro-Moscow president Viktor Yanukovych. Russia saw it as a threat and struck quickly. Masked soldiers without insignia seized government buildings in Crimea. Soon after, a controversial referendum was held, and Moscow declared Crimea part of Russia. The world called it illegal. Russia called it a return to the motherland. Since then, Crimea has remained at the heart of conflict. And in 2022, with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the peninsula became one of Moscow's main military bases. Missiles were launched from Crimea, supplies moved across the Kerch Bridge, while Ukraine struck back with drones and rockets at Sevastopol and the bridge itself. Once again, Crimea is at the center of a raging war. Today, demographically, Russians form the majority, followed by Ukrainians. And the Crimean Tatars, who despite centuries of deportation and persecution, still cling to their identity. And so, the question remains for the world, and for you. Will Ukraine ever be able to take Crimea back? Or is it impossible? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.